Alright, welcome back to the 12-Sixer channel. This is 12-Sixer, and today I'm actually here to go over a pairing system I created for Mahjong tournaments. I personally call it the Modified Swiss, and it's an attempt to perhaps improve on the current systems that are out there at this time. Excuse me. And at the end, there'll be a section specifically for the upcoming tournament of the Battle of the Coasts. That is not applicable to when using this system in general, so you can go ahead and ignore that if you're just looking at the system itself. So, current tournament formats, and why did I decide to go ahead and create this? It's dominated by current tournaments are now dominated by random pairings. So, the pros of it can be that it's done prior to the tournament because you create the matrix beforehand, you then randomize the numbers, assign them to the players, and then put them into the matrix, and then poof, your pairings are done. And to that extent, it can be made fully random and without bias, right? And it can basically assure there are no duplicate pairings unless something happens, like you start losing players in the tournament, you have to condense a table, and then the pairings are going to be thrown off and you have to finagle your way around it, right? So you're probably not going to face a duplicate unless it's a small enough field, but we'll get, that there may not be a way, usually can't get away around that anyways. Now, the cons, in my opinion, is that it can create uneven pairings near the tournament because they are fixed. So you don't know beforehand that one of the pairings could possibly be first versus fourth versus sixth versus 32nd, right? And so for first, fourth, and sixth, that's a pretty hard table because you're facing two other people that are in the top 6 or the top 8 or whatever you want to call it. And then if you look across from them, you might see a table that has 2nd, 17th, 33rd, and 64th. And at least on paper, at least the way the performances of those players have gone, the person in second place is on paper, a theoretically easier table and should be able to gain points. Whereas the person in first place is going to have a hard time, and maybe they don't do as well, and they drop out of first. Now, the pairings are random, so you could say that, it's without, it's fair in that sense. But if you're late in a tournament, and then those are the pairings, is that really fair for the players involved? Because, for instance, on the 1st, 5th, 6th, and 32nd, or 1st, 4th, 6th, and 32nd, there's guaranteed that one of those three, it's guaranteed, right? That one of those three will finish in third place or worse. At least one, could be two. And so what happens? Both of them that person drops out of 6th place and falls possibly further down the table for possibly just being at a table that was really hard as opposed to being at a table that's rather easier. On the other side of the coin, that person in 32nd can allow that person to play Kingmaker if they want to. If they're disinterested, they don't really care about playing in the tournament anymore, and they're playing 3 top players, they'd be like, it's like, okay, whatever, I'll just do whatever I want. And the next thing you know, they're starting to give points away like Oprah gives cars. And again, is that fair? Not necessarily, right? Because what if now look at the other side, what if first place gets a whole bunch of points and then second and third or the 4th and 6th place players are just standing there at the table and being like, we can't do anything about this. This other guy is feeding him all these points because he doesn't care anymore. And he just says, I'll just do whatever I want, right? So, on the flip side of it, you can have that situation. And in my opinion, random pairings do not take into account how well or how poorly a player is playing at the time. So it doesn't matter if you're winning the tournament, your pairing is going to be set beforehand that you're going to play, if you're first place, you're going to play 4th, 6th, and 32nd, right? When that time comes. There's no progression in terms of your strength of schedule, which I think, from my experience in playing in other types of games, in my opinion, should be there. So now we get to the point of what are Swiss pairings. Some of you may have heard about this type of pairing system, but if you haven't, they're generally used in one-on-one tournaments. From my experience, it's chess tournaments. And players are sorted each round by score and then paired against like competition. So let's take a field of 8. First round. You cut the field in half. You move the bottom half up to the top half. And then you look across. So 1 would face 5 because they're both at the top of each of the blocks. Then 2 versus 6. Then 3 versus 7. Then 4 versus 8. So that's the pairings for round 1. Now, let's assume that all the lower numbered people won. So, you have 1 through 4 having a win, and 5 through 8 having a loss. So what happens then? The people who have a win are then broken up in half, and then the bottom portion is moved up to the top portion. So now you have 1 versus 3 and 2 versus 4. And then at the bottom half, same thing happens. So now you have 5 versus 7 and 6 versus 8. Finally, in round 3, you're going to have 2 people who have 2 wins, so you pair them against each other. You have 4 people with 1 win, and so again, you split the group in half and you move that bottom half to the top, or at least to parallel to the top. And so now you have 3 versus 5 and 4 versus 6. And then you have 2 people with 2 losses, so you have 7 versus 8. And so the result of this 3-person tournament is that you have 1 winner who has 3 points, 3 people with 2 points, 3 people with 1 point, and 1 person with 0 points. Right? So, in terms of trying to figure out how to translate that directly into Mahjong, there's some benefits and drawbacks to it, or pros and cons as try and translate it over. The pro is that you can play competition that's closer to your current score level. That'd be the idea, right? As we break it up into groups, you should be playing people that are closer to your skill level. At least the idea would be, right? Or your current score level. I won't say skill level, because for me, tournaments are small sample size. And so if you really wanted to get an idea of person's skill, you'd have you'd play the long game. You play a whole bunch of games as opposed to a tournament where you're playing 7 or 8. 7 or 8 games is still a small sample size. So your current score level. So whatever you're doing so far, you're going to play people who are doing just as good, right? Or unfortunately, if you're doing badly, you play people who are doing just as bad. The idea being that you're playing people that are performing similarly to you in the tournament. It should allow for correction, right? It's not necessarily clear, but the idea being that, if you performed poorly in the first 2 rounds, more poorly than you normally do, now, again, your current ability in this tournament might mean that you're still going to play poorly for the rest of the tournament. But at the same time, you're going to play weaker competition, so if you're able to recover, you should be able to beat those people and then move up. Similarly, if you're doing really well in the tournament, and that's your baseline for that tournament, then it doesn't matter who you're playing against, you're going to win. But if you're just playing over your skis, because you've been playing weaker competition, because they're all at the bottom of the table, then as you play harder and harder competition, it should be harder and harder for you to continue staying near the top. So either way, you should be able to, you should be roughly kind of moving back into a general area of where your skill level is. Unless you're doing really well or really poorly, that's the idea. cons of it is, or at least the difficulties in creating a Swiss system, is that Mahjong is not a game of fixed results. So in that prior example, I mean, there are draws, but I didn't reflect it just for ease of the example. So there's only 3 different types of results that are possible: 0, 1/2, or 1. In Mahjong, unless you actually do standings by rank of what rank you finish in, and even then that's not necessarily easy, you're not going to have these neat delineated sections of people, because somebody who finished the first round in 3rd place with 22,000 points is going to have a completely different score than somebody who finished in 3rd place with 3,000 points, right? So because that's different, it's harder to create that delineation of places, or delineation of groups, right? Oops. In chess, you only play one person each round. And so you only cross off one potential opponent going forward. In Mahjong, you play 3 different opponents. So as the tournament progresses, there are going to be a significant amount of people that you have already played, and if we're trying to avoid duplicate pairings, this could be a problem, because I might have to switch you out with somebody else, and suddenly it's the pairing isn't as good as it should be, right? Especially if we just took it strictly as is. So I then worked on it and tinkered it with a bit, and I created a modified Swiss system. So what I do here is that instead what I do is I break the field of participants into fixed size groups instead of by scores for pairing purposes. So since there is not fixed outcomes where it's like 1, 0, 1 negative, or 1 1/2 0, the groups I do by size of the group as opposed to scores. Rounds in a tournament are then broken out into stages. So let's take an example of an 8-round tournament. Stage 1 of the tournament will be rounds 1 through 3. Stage 2 will be rounds 4 through 6. And stage 3 will be rounds 7 and 8. Now, why am I doing this? It's because within each stage, that fixed size group becomes smaller. So, for instance, in a field of 64, in stage 1, it's just one big group of 64 people. And then I pair it using that one big group, right? In stage 2, I basically cut the field in 2 from 1st through 32nd and 33rd through 64th. Now, they're not cut permanently. I'm just cutting them for pairing purposes, so that people in 1st through 32nd play each other in some manner or fashion, and people in 33rd through 64th play each other in some manner or fashion. So now the people that are at the top aren't necessarily people playing near the bottom, right? You're playing people that are who are closer to the top. And then in stage 3, I cut it again in half, and now you have 16 people. And so now you have 1st through 16th playing each other in round 7 and 8. Then 17th through 32nd. Now remember, this doesn't mean that if you're in 17th through 32nd, that's where you're going to stay. If you win and you move into the top 16, well, then in round 8, you're going to be paired in the top 16. But for pairing purposes, you're going to be in that block. So 1st through 16th, 17th through 32nd, 33rd through 48th, and 49th through 64th. So again, you're playing people even closer to you. That's how it's supposed to work. So again, to use a small example, group of 16. Early on, it's going to be that group of 16. So you can see me cutting into quartiles. And then each of those quartiles moves up basically to parallel with first through fourth. And then you just read across. First, fifth, ninth, 13th, second, sixth, 10, 14th, etc., etc. Now, let's get to stage 2, and again, look at first 1 through 16 as places 1 through 16. So first place through 16th place. In this particular case, then, I cut the field in half. So now, first through 8th will play each other in this stage, and 9th through 16th will play each other in each round of the stage. Again, remembering that after each round, you resort everybody by their points, and so if you move out of one group into another group, you will play in that group. Right? So, as you can see, I cut each of those sections of 8 into quartiles, and I move each of the quartiles up to the top, parallel to the first one, and I just look across. 1, 3, 5, 7, 2, 4, 6, 8. And the bottom, 9, 11, 13, 15, and 10, 12, 14, and 16. And then to take it to its natural conclusion, in stage 3, well, now I cut it into, and I cut those fields again into by half. So now it's in quarters, and well, I have 4 players left. So now it's 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus 4, 5 versus 6 versus 7 versus 8, etc. And this is an example, but it also highlights some of the issues that still happen as a result of using a modified Swiss, and I'll get into that in a bit. The first issue, though, when it comes to pairings in general, before we even get to that point, is the fact that it now allows the possibility of duplicate pairing. Because of the fact that they're not randomized beforehand, if I were just to move those sections up and look across, there is the possibility that at some later point in time, one person will have played another person, right? So even using this system can create a duplicate pairing if I just did it as is. The way to fix that is to switch people within those groups, those groups of players that I move up, right? So in that last example, or let's say in the first section, which I'll get into, I'll show an example in a bit, those groups of 4 that I move up to the top to be parallel with first through fourth, well, those group of 4 people should have scores that are roughly similar to each other, right? So then that means I can kind of tweak those players back and forth to see if I can somehow get rid of the duplicate. Now, it is quite possible that in a smaller field that duplicate pairings are going to happen and there is no good solution. In that particular event, the objective as a director would be to minimize the number of duplicates as possible and to minimize the number of times an individual player has duplicates. So you try to achieve both. Usually higher priority goes to the number of times a player has played another player. So you would be more concerned if somehow this duplicate pairing meant that player A was playing player B for the 3rd time in the tournament, as opposed to saying, okay, well, if I switch this pairing here, now player A will be playing players C and D for the 2nd time in this tournament. Like, that is probably more acceptable than saying, I'm going to play this person for the 3rd time in this tournament. So now to the example. Let's assume in stage 1 that players 2 and 6 have played each other in a prior round, right? So I look at that second line, and it's 2 versus 6 versus 10 and 14, and 2 has played 6. So how do you fix it? So you take the lowered seeded player that's in this violation of a duplicate pairing, in this case 6, and I swap it with the next person down, number 7. And I swap those two. Because remember, 6th and 7th should have close points to each other, so their current skill level at the time should be roughly the same. So then the new pairings are 2 versus 7 versus 10 versus 14, and 3 versus 6 versus 11 versus 15. And so then you ask yourself, are there still duplicates? If there are not, and I do apologize, I'm doing this presentation in Google presentation or whatever you want to call it, because for some reason, the computer where I made this PowerPoint presentation, the file that it created somehow will not open on my laptop, and I have no idea why. And I would rather get this out rather than having to figure out what the problem is. So, if there are no duplicates, then you're done. Your pairings are set, right? Because now we've eliminated duplicates. People are still playing each other in the same block, as it were. So we're done. Now, if we're not, again, apologize for the errors, what you would do is you would reset the pairings to the original pairings, and you'd say, okay, well, swapping 6 and 7 didn't work. Well, what about the neighbor above it? What about 5? So then I'll switch 6 and 5 and see if those two new pairings still have a duplicate pairing. And if that doesn't work, then I'll go two spots away where 8th place lives, and I'll say, can I switch 6 and 8 and avoid duplicates? Now you can only go so far with this, right? 2 is already pushing it. Because again, the further you go away from that player, the bigger the point gap difference is. And so now you're getting into, okay, well, is this really a fairish trade in that sense? And also note that unless it's an extreme example, and it's usually very, very rare, I wouldn't go 6th and then look 2 places in the opposite direction and look at 4th, because 4th is in a different block, right? Because 4th is within 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not within 5, 6, 7, 8 where 6 resides. So I wouldn't switch 4 and 6 unless there was a really good justification to do so. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. You would have to let the duplicate stand as is. So, what are possible issues that happen with a modified Swiss? So, even though we're trying to get people in these groups to play each other with similar score levels, as it were, you could have an issue of leapfrogging, right? So, take the first example, where you have first in stage 3, where you have 1st through 4th places playing each other and 5th through 8th places facing each other. Well, 2 of those people on the top 4 are going to finish 3rd and 4th, and they're going to have the penalty of a negative UMA when they're done. Well, if you look at the table below them, 2 of those people from 5th through 8th are going to win and get positive points. And so chances are then that they are going to swap places. Right? So in that case, is it really fair? Because then you go back to the other issue before of like, well, 2 of those players are guaranteed to lose, and 2 of the other players on the other table are guaranteed to win. So, is it fair that in the penultimate round, I ended up being in the top 4, and now I got a harder pairing, and now I've lost, and now I'm not even in the top 8 anymore, right? It's a fair criticism. So usually what happens is that, you can do one of 2 things. If you don't have a playoff, you could theoretically just for the last round lock each group within their respective places. So if 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th have to play each other, then the loser of that table can finish no worse than 4th. Or 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, none of those players can do any better than 5th. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing you can do, and I don't really have it listed, and this is the way you kind of fix this, is that the stage 3, or whatever the final stage is of your pairing process, if there is a playoff, that stage 3 is going to be divided into groups of whatever that playoff size is times 2. I wish I had kind of put this in an example, but I'll try to explain it. So, if there's a playoff and the top 4 people advance to the playoff, then you want the final 2 rounds to be where it's the top 8 that play each other, 4 times 2. Why? Because In that way, the pairings would theoretically be 1 versus 3 versus 5 versus 7 and 2 versus 4 versus 6 versus 8. And why does that matter? Well, because it's the top 4, there are 2 players from each of those tables that are above 4th place, and 2 of the people at the table that are below 4th place. Which means that there is still a possibility that the 2 players that are in the top 4 can finish first and second and keep their place in the top 4. Right? So if first and second finish, or first and third finish first and second and fourth place finish first and second at their table, then they're all getting positive points, and chances are they're going to stay in the top 4, barring a leapfrog from somebody at the lower table. Now, it can happen. Somebody who's at the next group of 8 with 9 versus 11 versus 13 versus 15 could score a huge game and leapfrog into 4th place, but at the same time, you're talking about moving from 9th place to 4th place. And so the idea hopefully being that because you've created it in groups of the playoff size times 2, that it's going to require basically playing a Herculean game to move from 9th to 4th. It can happen, don't get me wrong. In fact, in the Seattle tournament that I ran in 2020, that exactly happened. Somebody who was not part of that first group managed to make a high score and catapult themselves into the playoffs. But at the same time, if they did it, then they either got lucky or they deserved it. But it also is incredibly hard, and that's also the point. You can do it, but the path is not easy. And and so that leads me to the second part. Oh, before I get there. So usually when it comes to these types of things, where you have these small field sizes, you wouldn't go with a modified Swiss anyways, because it creates issues like that near the end of a tournament, in which then you just switch to a round robin or a random tournament because you don't have the numbers. Another issue with a Swiss tournament you could think of is sandbagging, where, usually a general example is somebody in the first round of a tournament, one of the stronger players, will take a draw early, even if it's against an inferior opponent. Because now they're suddenly in the group with 1/2 of a point. And that either means that they're going to play somebody else who has 1/2 of a point, and it's going to be somebody who's weaker than them. Or, if they're lucky, and there's an odd number of people with 1 point, they get promoted into that 1 point group, but they're playing the worst person of the first half of those 1 point people. It sounds a little complicated. But either way, they get a favorable pairing, and because they started out with the 1/2 point, they're going to get a favorable pairing for the remainder of the tournament, and probably avoid playing the best players. Now, you can't do that in Mahjong per se, because you're playing 3 other people, right? And as the rounds progress and you go through the stages, you will play harder and harder people regardless of your score. Not to mention that in the beginning, when I had, you take that example of 16 players, if you do poorly in the first round and you finish and you're in 13th place, you're still going to have to face 1st place, 5th place, and 19th place. Oh, sorry, 1st, 5th, and 9th. Sorry. Is that any easier of a pairing than if you actually did better? Probably not. So the idea of sandbagging isn't necessarily a big issue. I'm sure somebody can find a way to, again, get into that position where you're just out of the top 8 or top, the top group, and you put a big round together and you jump yourself up there. But again, that requires a lot of things to go your way. So, for those of you participating in the Battle of the Coasts, now I'm going to get to the variation of the modified Swiss that will apply for this tournament. So, as you know, in the Battle of the Coast, we're broken up into 2 teams, East and West, with equal the number of players, 32. And the requirement is that there's always 2 players from each team at a table. Which means then that when I do my pairing system, instead of breaking it up, like, say, I had to break it up into quartiles, now I just have to divide it in half. Or, I divide it, go the other way where I divide it even further, because I only need 2 players from one team, from that one group, and then I grab 2 players on the other side that have nothing to do in terms of the standings that the other team does, if that makes sense. I'll get into that. I'll get into it in a bit, into the example here. And like I said, each of the players on each team are going to be paired from one person from their team, and then the same place people on the other team. And I'll get to what that means. So, in this modified Swiss example, if this thing would go away, please. Can you go away? There we go. So you have, let's say in the beginning, you have 16 people on each team. And I've randomized the 16 players. I would divide the field in half and move that bottom half to the top half, and I would look across. So West 1 would be paired up with West 9. Well, on the other side, and again, sorry for the arrows, it's, Google presentation is not as compatible with PowerPoint. The same thing's happening on the other side, right? So then those like places play each other. So West 1 and West 9 plays East 1 and East 9. West 2 and West 10 faces East 2 and East 10, and so on down the line. Now, as we get into future stages here, what happens then is that I cut each of the teams in half, and then I take those halves and then cut them in half again. And in the case of the top half, where it's 1st through 8th, after sorting by points, I move the bottom half to the top and I look across. So it's West 1 and West 5 that are paired with each other, right? Well, then they face their counterparts on the other team. So it's East 1 versus East 5. And you go on down the line until you hit West 4th versus West 8th versus East 4th versus East 8th. And then you look down to the bottom half, it's West 9th versus West 13th and East 9th versus East 13th, and down the line. And so the stage 3 would be to then take each of those divisions that you see there and then divide them again. So in this particular case, it would have been West 1 and West 2 versus East 1 and East 2, and West 3 and West 4 versus East 3 and East 4. Wait, do I have that right? No, I don't have that right. Sorry. My mind's brain farting at this point. If I cut it again and cut it in half, it would be West 1 versus West 3 and versus East 1 and East 3, and then West 2 and West 4 versus East 2 and East 4. That's how the pairing would go in stage 3. So, and so on down the line. So hopefully that makes sense of the Swiss, modified Swiss system that I created. I'm pretty sure that some of you are googly-eyed, and that's understandable. If you have questions, you can reply to you can comment in the video, or you can look me up at 12sixer on Twitter and ask me questions on that, and I'll be glad to try to explain it as best as I can, answer as best I can. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again.